Kids only bring trouble, not for me. James Walker's voice echoed in his own mind as he watched another family struggle with their crying infant outside the general store. The mother looked exhausted, bouncing the baby while trying to calm two other children who were pulling at her worn skirts. The father counted coins with shaking hands, clearly short on what they needed. Chaos. Pure chaos. James adjusted his black hat and spurred his horse forward, eager to escape the scene. He had business in town, nothing more. Get his supplies, check his mail, and ride back to the blessed silence of his ranch where the only sounds were wind through grass and cattle lowing in the distance. The autumn of 1887 had brought another wave of families to Copper Ridge, Montana. Each wagon train deposited more settlers with their dreams of new beginnings and their inevitable disappointments. James had seen it all before. The wide-eyed hope that slowly died under the harsh reality of frontier life. He'd made his choice 15 years ago when he'd bought his land. No wife to worry about, no children to feed and protect, no sleepless nights wondering if he was doing right by anyone except himself and his livestock. Smart man keeps his life simple, he muttered, dismounting near the hitching post. But what James didn't know was that everything he believed about his perfectly ordered world was about to crumble. The Saturday market was in full swing in the town square. Farmers displayed their vegetables on wooden tables while their wives sold preserves and fresh bread. Children darted between the stalls like wild rabbits, their laughter mixing with the calls of merchants hawking their wares. James moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, avoiding eye contact, keeping conversations brief. He had a reputation in Copper Ridge, fair but cold, reliable but distant, the kind of man you could count on in a crisis but wouldn't invite to Sunday dinner. That's when he saw her. A woman stood near the fabric merchant's stall, her hand resting protectively on a small child's shoulder. Even from a distance, James could see the exhaustion etched in every line of her posture. Her dark blue dress was clean, but patched in several places, and her brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun that had seen better days. Eliza Bennett. He'd heard the name whispered around town for the past week. A widow, some said. Others claimed she'd been abandoned. Either way, she'd arrived on the last wagon train with nothing but a small trunk and the little girl who now tugged at her mother's skirt. "Mama, look at the pretty ribbons," the child said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. Lily, that was the girl's name. James had overheard Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house mention it to the pastor's wife. 6 years old, full of questions, and completely unaware that her mother counted every penny twice before spending it. James tried to focus on his shopping list, but something about the pair drew his attention like a magnet. The woman Eliza was examining a bolt of plain cotton with the careful concentration of someone making every decision count. Her fingers traced the fabric gently, almost reverently. "How much for 2 yards?" she asked the merchant. $1.50, came the reply. James saw her shoulders slump slightly. She opened her small purse and counted the coins inside, her lips moving silently. After a long moment, she shook her head. "Perhaps next week." The disappointment in her voice was carefully controlled, but James caught it. So did the little girl. "It's okay, Mama," Lily said, reaching up to pat her mother's arm. "We don't need new curtains. The old ones still keep the light out." The simple acceptance in the child's voice hit James like a physical blow. He'd expected whining, tears, demands. Instead, this tiny person was comforting her mother with a wisdom far beyond her years. "You're right, sweetheart," Eliza replied, forcing brightness into her tone. "We have everything we need." But they didn't. James could see it clearly. The woman's boots were worn thin at the heels. The child's dress, while clean, was too short in the sleeves. They were hanging on by threads, putting on a brave face for a world that had already taken too much from them. "Move along, Walker," he told himself. "Not your problem." He turned toward the hardware store, determined to finish his business and get out of town. But fate had other plans. A gust of wind caught a display of apples, sending several rolling across the dusty ground. One bumped against James's boot, and before he could stop himself, he bent to pick it up. "Oh, thank you, mister." James looked up to find himself staring into the brightest brown eyes he'd ever seen. Lily had followed the apple and now stood barely 3 feet away, looking up at him with a smile that could melt winter snow. "You're welcome," he managed, handing her the apple. "Lily, come away from the gentleman," Eliza called, hurrying over. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Walker." "James Walker." Eliza's cheeks flushed pink. "Mr. Walker, I apologize." Lily, we mustn't bother people when they're trying to conduct their business. He's not bothered, Mama, Lily said with the confidence only children possess. Are you, Mr. James? You have kind eyes. Kind eyes? James nearly laughed. He'd been called many things in his 38 years, but kind wasn't usually one of them. Lily. Eliza's voice carried a note of warning, but the damage was done. The little girl had looked at him and somehow seen past the carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself. For just a moment, standing there in the dusty market square with autumn sunlight dancing in her hair, James felt something crack inside his chest. A memory, long buried, surfaced unbidden. Another little girl with bright eyes and wild dreams. His sister Sarah, who died of fever when he was barely 20. She'd looked at the world the same way Lily did now, with wonder and trust and absolute faith that tomorrow would be better than today. We should go, Eliza said quietly, taking Lily's hand. Thank you again for your help. James watched them walk away, the woman's head held high despite everything, the child skipping beside her as if poverty and uncertainty were just temporary inconveniences. They disappeared into the crowd, but the echo of Lily's laughter lingered in the air like a ghost. That evening, as James sat on his porch watching the first stars appear over the mountains, he couldn't shake the image of those brown eyes looking up at him with such trust. Kids only bring trouble, he said aloud, testing the words that had been his motto for so long. But for the first time in 15 years they felt like a lie. What if he was wrong? What if everything he'd believed about children, about family, about the kind of life worth living, was nothing more than fear dressed up as wisdom? The questions followed him into sleep, and with them came dreams of bright eyes and laughter that sounded like hope. 3 days had passed since the market encounter, and James had convinced himself he'd forgotten all about the woman and her child. He rode into town on Wednesday morning with his usual list of errands, determined to keep his mind on practical matters. The autumn air carried a crisp bite that promised winter wasn't far behind. Copper Ridge looked different in the morning light. Cleaner somehow, with fewer people cluttering the streets. This was how James preferred it. Quiet, manageable. But what he didn't expect was to see them again so soon. Eliza Bennet stood outside the post office reading a letter with the kind of concentration that suggested life-changing news. Her face had gone pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she held the paper. Lily sat on the wooden steps beside her, carefully arranging a collection of smooth stones she'd apparently gathered from somewhere. "Mama, are you sad again?" the little girl asked, looking up with those impossibly bright eyes. "No, sweetheart," Eliza replied, though her voice cracked slightly. "Just thinking." James dismounted near the bank, telling himself he had business to conduct and no reason to pay attention to anyone else's troubles. But something about the woman's posture, the way her shoulders sagged as if carrying an invisible weight, made him pause. That's when Mrs. Fletcher and Mrs. Morrison emerged from the general store, their voices carrying clearly across the quiet street. "I'm telling you, there's something not right about that woman," Mrs. Fletcher was saying, her tone dripping with false concern. "Shows up with no husband, no family, just that child. What kind of decent woman travels alone like that? And did you see the state of their clothes?" Mrs. Morrison added. "I heard she's staying in that old cabin behind the church. Haven't seen her at Sunday service once." James felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard this kind of talk before, the way small towns could turn on outsiders who didn't fit their narrow expectations. It made his stomach turn. "Maybe she's running from something," Mrs. Fletcher continued, lowering her voice just enough to sound scandalous. "Or someone. Mark my words, no good will come of letting people like that settle here." Eliza's back went rigid. She'd heard every word, James realized. How could she not have? The women weren't even trying to be subtle. "Mama?" Lily tugged at her mother's skirt. "Why are those ladies talking about us?" "They're not, sweetheart," Eliza said quietly, folding the letter and slipping it into her pocket. "Come along, we need to get to the boarding house." But as they started to walk away, one of Lily's carefully arranged stones rolled off the step and across the dusty street. Without thinking, the little girl chased after it, her small feet carrying her directly into James's path. "Oh!" she exclaimed, looking up at him with surprise and then delight. "It's Mr. James. Hello again." James found himself looking down into that radiant smile, and something inside his chest did that strange fluttering thing again. "Hello, Lily." The fact that he remembered her name seemed to please her enormously. "I'm collecting pretty rocks," she announced, holding up the stone she'd retrieved. "This one looks like a heart, don't you think?" James examined the smooth gray stone, With a child's imagination, he supposed it could resemble a heart. I suppose it does. You can have it if you want, Lily said, extending the stone toward him with the generous spirit only children possessed, for being nice to me at the market. Lily. Eliza appeared beside them, slightly out of breath. I told you not to run into the street. Her eyes met James's briefly, and he saw a flash of embarrassment there. I'm sorry, Mr. Walker. She's still learning about boundaries. No harm done, James heard himself saying, though he made no move to take the offered stone. Please take it, Lily insisted, pressing the rock into his palm before he could protest. Mama says when someone is kind to you, you should be kind back. The simple warmth of the child's small hand against his calloused fingers sent an unexpected shock through James's system. When was the last time anyone had touched him with such innocent trust? That's very generous, he managed, closing his fingers around the stone. Eliza's cheeks had turned pink again. We should let Mr. Walker get on with his business, Lily. But the little girl wasn't finished. Mr. James, do you live in a big house? Mama and I live in a tiny one. It's cozy, but sometimes I wish we had a garden where I could plant flowers. Lily, that's enough questions, Eliza said firmly, though James caught the note of pain in her voice. A garden, such a simple dream for a child to have. I have land, James found himself saying, though he couldn't quite believe the words were coming out of his mouth. Plenty of space for gardens. Really? Lily's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. Do you grow flowers? No, James admitted. Just practical things. Flowers are practical, Lily declared with absolute certainty. They make everything prettier and they smell nice and the bees like them. Mama taught me that. Despite himself, James felt the corner of his mouth twitch. The child's logic was hard to argue with. Lily, we really must go, Eliza said, but there was less urgency in her voice now. She was studying James with curious eyes, as if trying to figure out why this supposedly cold man was standing in the street, having a conversation about flowers with her daughter. One more question, Mama, please. Lily turned back to James. Mr. James, are you lonely living all by yourself? The question hit James like a physical blow. In 6 simple words, this tiny person had cut straight to the heart of something he'd spent 15 years trying to ignore. She started, then stopped. How did you explain to a child that loneliness was a choice, a necessary protection against the pain that came with caring too much? Everyone gets lonely sometimes, Eliza said softly, saving him from having to answer. That's why it's important to be kind to each other. The gratitude James felt toward her in that moment was almost overwhelming. She could have used the opportunity to embarrass him, to point out his contradictions. Instead, she'd offered him an unexpected grace. We should go, she said again, taking Lily's hand. Thank you for being patient with her questions. As they walked away, James heard Mrs. Fletcher's voice rise again from across the street. Well, I never. That Walker man actually talking to someone. Wonder what that's about. James turned and fixed the woman with a stare that could have frozen water in July. She immediately busied herself with her packages and hurried away. That evening, James sat on his porch as the sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple. In his pocket, the heart-shaped stone felt warm against his fingers. He pulled it out and examined it in the fading light. Such a simple gift from such a small person. Yet it seemed to carry more weight than it should. Are you lonely living all by yourself? The question echoed in his mind as darkness settled over the valley. He'd built his life around solitude, convinced himself it was what he wanted. No complications, no responsibilities, no heartbreak when people inevitably left or let you down. But sitting there in the gathering darkness, James had to admit the truth he'd been running from for 15 years. He was lonely, desperately, achingly lonely. And somehow, a 6-year-old girl with bright eyes and a generous heart had seen right through all his carefully constructed defenses in a single moment. Why can't I get that little girl's smile out of my mind? He whispered to the empty night. Why couldn't he stop thinking about that little girl's smile? The stone felt heavier in his palm, and James realized with growing unease that his perfectly ordered world was already beginning to crack around the edges. Saturday morning brought crisp October air. James was mending fence posts when he heard voices across the valley. He spotted 2 familiar figures struggling near the old creek bridge. Eliza and Lily. They wrestled with a large sack that had split open, spilling feed grain across the wooden planks. James could see Eliza's frustration as she gathered scattered contents while keeping Lily from the creek's edge. Not my problem, he muttered, turning back to his fence. But his hands stilled on the hammer, and his eyes kept drifting back. The sack was too heavy for Eliza alone, and each gust scattered more grain into the water. Lily tried helping by collecting individual kernels in her small hands, a hopeless task. James stood there for a full minute, war raging in his chest. He'd built his life around minding his own business. Other people's troubles were exactly that, other people's troubles. But something about that little girl on her hands and knees, determinedly gathering grain kernel by kernel, broke through his resolve like water through a dam. "Damn," he growled, setting down his hammer. By the time he reached the bridge, Eliza had tied off the torn end, but grain continued leaking through the damaged burlap. Her face was flushed with exertion and embarrassment. "Mr. Walker," she said, straightening quickly. "I'm sorry if we're trespassing. We were trying to get this feed to the boarding house, but the sack caught on a nail." "It's not trespassing," James said curtly. "This is the main road." He examined the torn sack. The damage was beyond simple repair. The burlap had ripped along a seam, creating a gap too large to hold contents securely. "You're fighting a losing battle with that," he observed. Eliza's chin lifted slightly. Pride. The kind of stubborn pride that would rather struggle alone than accept help from a stranger. "We'll manage," she said. "Mama, look." Lily appeared beside them, small hands cupped around grain kernels. "I saved these ones from the water." The sight of those tiny hands trying so earnestly to fix an impossible situation did something uncomfortable to James's insides. Without thinking, he shrugged out of his work coat and spread it on the bridge. "Transfer what you can onto this," he told Eliza. "I'll carry it wherever you need it." "Oh, but we couldn't," Eliza began. "It's not a favor," James said gruffly. "It's practical." Their eyes met, and James saw something flicker across her face. Relief mixed with wariness. "Mr. James," Lily bounced over to him, her collection of grain still carefully cradled in her palms. "I saved these for you. Mama says when someone helps you, you should give them something nice back." She held out her hands, offering him the grain with the same generous spirit she'd shown with the heart-shaped stone. James stared down at the scattered kernels, worth less than a penny, being offered as if they were gold nuggets. "That's very thoughtful," he managed. "Do you have chickens, Mr. James?" Lily asked, eyes bright with curiosity. "These would be good for chickens. All animals get hungry just like people do." James found himself looking into those earnest brown eyes and feeling something shift inside his chest. When was the last time anyone had thought about whether he got hungry? This child who had so little herself was worried about his well-being. "I don't have chickens," he said quietly. "Oh." Lily's face fell slightly, then brightened with typical child resilience. "Well, maybe someday you'll get some. Then you'll have these grains ready for them." She pressed the kernels into his palm with absolute seriousness, as if handing over something precious. The warmth of her small fingers against his calloused skin sent that same unexpected shock through his system. "Lily, let Mr. Walker get on with his work," Eliza said softly, but there was less urgency in her voice than before. She was watching the interaction with something like wonder. Together they transferred the remaining grain onto James's coat. It was more than he'd expected, probably 40 pounds worth of feed that represented a significant expense for someone in Eliza's situation. "Where are you taking this?" he asked, bundling the corners together. "The boarding house," Eliza replied. "Mrs. Henderson lets us keep chickens in her backyard in exchange for eggs." James nodded and lifted the bundle. It wasn't particularly heavy for him, but would have been impossible for Eliza to manage alone. They walked toward town, Lily skipping ahead, chattering about changing leaf colors and pointing out cloud formations. "Why is that one shaped like a horse?" she asked James, stopping to point at a puffy white cloud. James found himself actually looking up at the sky, something he rarely did unless checking weather. "Clouds don't really have shapes," he said. "People just imagine them." "But it's fun to imagine," Lily replied with simple wisdom. "Don't you think fun is important?" The question caught James off guard. Fun. When was the last time he'd considered whether something was fun? His life was built around necessity, efficiency, survival. "I suppose it has its place," he said carefully. "Everything has its place," Lily agreed sagely. "Even sad things. Mama says sometimes we need to be sad so we can remember how good it feels to be happy." They reached the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson's chickens clucked and fussed in their small coop, clearly anticipating their meal. James deposited the grain in the storage bin Eliza indicated, then stood awkwardly as she tried to figure out how to thank him. "Thank you. I didn't know what else to do," she said formally. No need, James replied, retrieving his coat and shaking out the last bits of grain. The fabric smelled like feed and sunshine, and something else, something that reminded him of home. Mr. James, Lily called out as he prepared to leave. She was crouched by wildflowers that had somehow survived the first frost. Would you like one of these? They're pretty and they smell nice. She held up a small purple aster, its petals slightly wilted but still holding traces of autumn color. Another gift. Another moment of pure, uncomplicated generosity. James looked down at the flower, then at the earnest face offering it to him. Something cracked inside his chest. Not painfully, but like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. Thank you, he said, taking the flower with more care than he'd ever shown anything so fragile. That evening, James sat on his porch as darkness settled over the valley. The purple aster lay on the table beside his coffee cup, looking impossibly delicate against the rough wood. In his pocket, the heart-shaped stone had been joined by a few kernels of grain. Such small things. A flower, a stone, a handful of grain, yet they seemed to carry more weight than anything he'd accumulated in 15 years of careful solitude. Lily's laughter echoed in his memory. Bright and uninhibited, the sound of someone who still believed the world was fundamentally good. When was the last time he'd laughed like that? When had he last seen shapes in clouds? I never wanted children, he said aloud to the empty night, testing the words that had been his creed for so long. But as he sat there in the gathering darkness, with the child's gifts spread before him like offerings to some forgotten god, James had to confront a truth that terrified him more than any wild animal or harsh winter ever had. He was starting to care. Despite every wall he'd built, every rule he'd made, a 6-year-old girl with bright eyes and a generous heart was slowly, inexorably, changing everything he thought he knew about himself. So why does her laughter follow me into the dark? He whispered. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and James realized with growing unease that his carefully constructed world was no longer big enough to hold both his old beliefs and the new feelings growing in his chest like wildflowers after rain. Tuesday's market day brought trouble. James noticed the crowd outside the general store, their voices sharp with small-town cruelty. Something's not right about that woman, Mrs. Fletcher was saying loudly. Shows up with a child but no husband, no family. Poor thing probably doesn't even know who her real father is, Mrs. Morrison added. James felt his jaw tighten. Something about the venom in their voices made him pause. Women like that bring nothing but trouble to decent communities, Mrs. Fletcher continued. Next thing you know, she'll be setting her sights on one of our men. That's when James saw them. Eliza and Lily were walking down the main street, heads held high despite the hostile stares. Lily skipped beside her mother, oblivious to the tension crackling around them, but Eliza's shoulders were rigid, her face carefully composed. There she is now, Mrs. Morrison whispered loudly. Bold as brass, parading that child around like she has every right. Someone should tell her what decent folk think of her kind, Mrs. Fletcher replied. James watched Eliza's step falter slightly. She'd heard every word. Mama, why are those ladies staring at us? Lily asked innocently. They're not, sweetheart, Eliza replied quietly, but James caught the tremor in her voice. Just keep walking. But Mrs. Fletcher stepped directly into their path, forcing Eliza to stop. I think it's time someone spoke plainly. Mrs. Fletcher announced loudly. This is a respectable town, Mrs. Bennet. We don't appreciate your kind bringing shame to our community. The color drained from Eliza's face, but she kept her chin up. I'm not sure what you mean, Mrs. Fletcher. Oh, I think you know exactly what I mean, Mrs. Fletcher shot back. A woman traveling alone with a child and no husband. We have children in this town to protect. Mama? Lily tugged at her mother's skirt, confusion and fear creeping into her voice. What's wrong? Why is the lady angry? That did it. James had spent 15 years minding his own business, but watching that little girl's face crumple with confusion while her mother took undeserved abuse, something inside him snapped. That's enough. His voice cut through the crowd like a blade. Every head turned as he stepped away from his horse. This doesn't concern you, Mr. Walker, Mrs. Fletcher said. When you're speaking loud enough for the whole street to hear, it concerns everyone, James replied coldly. We have every right to protect our community, Mr. Fletcher blustered. From what? From a woman making an honest living? From a child who's done nothing but exist? She has no husband, Mrs. Morrison protested. Neither do half the widows in this town. Are you running them out too? James fixed Mrs. Fletcher with a cold stare. I see a woman who works harder than most men here, who takes care of her child without asking for handouts. The crowd was silent. James Walker hadn't spoken this many words in public in years. But standing around gossiping, tearing down someone who's never harmed you, that brings shame to a community. How dare you? Mrs. Fletcher started. I'll speak to you exactly like what you are, James cut her off. Bullies picking on someone who can't fight back. Lily had pressed closer to her mother, staring up at James with wide eyes, clearly recognizing that he was defending them. Mr. James, she whispered, and something in that tiny voice hit him like a physical blow. The crowd began to disperse, people suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere. Within minutes the street had cleared, leaving only James, Eliza, and Lily standing in the afternoon dust. You didn't have to do that, Eliza said quietly, but her voice was thick with gratitude. Yes, I did, James replied, surprising himself with the certainty. A spooked horse broke free from the hitching post, reins trailing as it bolted down the main street. People scattered, but the animal was too frightened to stop. Lily, startled by the commotion, stepped backward into the street. James didn't think, he simply moved. In 3 strides he was there, scooping Lily into his arms and rolling them both clear as the horse thundered past. They landed in the dirt. James curled protectively around the little girl. Lily lifted her head from his chest and looked up with those trusting brown eyes. You saved me, she said simply. James looked down at that earnest little face, dirt-streaked but unharmed, and something fundamental shifted inside his chest. This was love. Pure. Terrifying love for a child who wasn't his, who he'd sworn he didn't want, who had somehow crawled past every defense he'd built. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice rougher than usual. Lily shook her head, then surprised him by reaching up to brush dirt from his cheek. Are you hurt, Mr. James? Before he could answer, Eliza was there, dropping to her knees beside them, her face pale with shock. Oh my God, Lily. Are you all right? I'm fine, Mama, Lily said solemnly. Mr. James caught me, like a hero in the stories. Eliza's eyes met James's over her daughter's head, and he saw something there that made his breath catch. Gratitude, yes, but something deeper. Thank you, she whispered, and those 2 words carried more weight than any speech. James got to his feet and helped them both up, his hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. The immediate danger was over, but his heart was still racing. Let me walk you home, he said, though it came out more like a command than an offer. Eliza nodded, still too shaken to argue. They made their way through the quiet streets, Lily chattering excitedly about her adventure while the adults walked in stunned silence. When they reached the small cabin behind the church, James hesitated at the gate. Now that the crisis was over, his old habits were reasserting themselves. Keep distance, don't get involved. But as he turned to leave, Lily called out to him. Mr. James, will you come visit us sometime? Mama makes really good biscuits. He looked back at that hopeful little face, then at Eliza standing behind her daughter. Maybe, he heard himself say. A smile that lit up Lily's face could have powered the whole town. That night James sat on his porch long after the sun had set, staring out at the darkness and trying to make sense of what had happened. He'd broken every rule he'd lived by for 15 years. He'd made himself a target for gossip. He'd gotten involved in other people's business. And worst of all, he'd discovered something about himself that terrified him more than any wild animal or harsh winter ever had. Maybe what I feared all along was needing someone this much. The admission hung in the air, and James realized his carefully constructed world of solitude was crumbling, and for the first time in 15 years he wasn't sure he wanted to build it back up. Dawn came too early and too quiet. James sat on his porch with morning coffee, watching the sun paint the mountains gold, but his mind wasn't on the sunrise. Every time he closed his eyes he saw Lily's trusting face, heard her small voice saying, "You saved me." I never wanted children, he said aloud to the empty morning, testing words that had been his armor. But they felt hollow now. Footsteps on gravel pulled him from his thoughts. Eliza was walking up the path, steps hesitant but determined. Lily skipped beside her, apparently recovered from yesterday's adventure. James set down his coffee and stood, his heart doing something complicated. "Morning," Eliza said when they reached the porch. She looked different, softer around the edges. "Morning," James replied. "Everything all right?" "I wanted to thank you," Eliza said simply. "What you did yesterday. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand up for us." You don't need to thank me. Yes, I do. Her voice was quiet but firm. You didn't have to get involved. I'm not most people, James said, wondering where those words came from. Mr. James, Lily bounded up the steps. Look what I found. She held out a perfectly round pebble. Another gift, offered with generous spirit. It's very nice, James said, but when he reached to take it, Lily threw her arms around his legs in a fierce hug. Thank you for saving me yesterday. You're the bravest person I know. James stood frozen, this tiny person clinging to him with complete trust, and felt something crack wide open inside his chest. When was the last time anyone had hugged him? Slowly, he placed his hand on her head. Her hair was soft, warm from morning sun. You're welcome, little one, he said quietly. When Lily let go, she was beaming. Aren't you lonely living all by yourself? There was that question again, the one that cut straight to his heart. Sometimes, James admitted. We get lonely too, don't we, Mama? But not when we're together. Together is better. James looked at Eliza and saw something in her eyes. A question maybe, or an invitation. Would you like breakfast with us? Eliza asked, color rising in her cheeks. Lily makes excellent biscuits. I helped Mama this morning, Lily chimed proudly. They're lopsided, but they taste good. James was standing at a crossroads. He could say no and retreat to a safe, solitary life, or take a step into something unknown and wonderful. I'd like that, he heard himself say. Lily's smile was brighter than sunrise. Really? This is the best day ever, she declared. Her cheeks flushed and her small hands clutching a wild flower she had picked along the way. The petals were slightly torn, yet she held it with the same pride as if it were a treasure beyond measure, her eyes sparkling with the joy of giving. As they walked toward town, Lily chattering between them, James felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. Hope, the feeling that maybe he'd found where he belonged. At the small cabin, Eliza set the table while Lily displayed her lopsided but golden biscuits. They smell wonderful, James said, meaning it. Sit, sit, Lily commanded, patting the chair beside her. You're our guest of honor. As they ate breakfast together, James watched the easy interaction between mother and daughter. Eliza cutting Lily's biscuit, Lily sharing her honey without being asked. This is nice, he said quietly. It is, Eliza agreed, meeting his eyes. It's been a long time since we've had company. After eating, Lily showed James her rock collection. She held up the heart-shaped stone from their first meeting. This one is special. It's for people you love. She pressed it into his hand. Now you have to keep it forever and ever. Forever and ever, James repeated solemnly. When it came time to leave, James found himself reluctant to go. Thank you, he said to Eliza at the gate. For everything. Thank you. For reminding me I'm not alone, she said quietly, her voice trembling as if each word carried the weight of sleepless nights and silent prayers. She wanted to say more, to explain the fear and the loneliness that had shadowed her days, but all she could manage was that fragile confession. She replied quietly. Mr. James, Lily called from the doorway. Will you come back tomorrow? James looked at that hopeful little face, then at Eliza's guarded expression, and felt his world shift completely. I'd like that very much, he said. That evening, James sat on his porch as sunset painted the sky rose and gold. Everything felt different now, as if someone had opened windows in a house shuttered too long. In his pocket, the heart-shaped stone felt warm. On his table sat one of Lily's lopsided biscuits, saved for later. In his memory, laughter echoed through rooms silent for 15 years. I never wanted children, he said quietly to the gathering darkness. But as he sat there planning tomorrow's visit and thinking about Lily's hug and Eliza's smile across the breakfast table, James realized something that changed everything. But maybe what I wanted all along was them. The thought lingered like a whispered promise, both frightening and comforting. For the first time in so long, he imagined a tomorrow that wasn't set empty. He imagined laughter at the table and footsteps echoing across the porch. The admission settled over him like peace, and for the first time in 15 years, James Walker allowed himself to imagine a future that included more than survival. A future with small feet running across his porch, grateful eyes across a dinner table, the wild joy of being needed by people who chose to love him. Maybe children didn't bring trouble after all. Maybe they brought exactly what he'd been missing, a reason to believe tomorrow could be better than today. As the first stars appeared, James smiled and began planning how to build a proper swing for the oak tree by his front porch. After all, Every little girl needed a swing, and every man needed someone to push.